Hello everyone and most welcome to H687. We are today recording in the church of Kumla. It's a beautiful church from the beginning of the 19th century. And Kalle just pointed out its interior is formed by the neoclassical device, yes, and we see Egyptian pillars. We are currently in the museum part that exhibits details from the two previous churches that has been situated on the same locale. It's quite interesting. And we actually have some sun showing up for a bit. It's been gone for a while. As you know, in Sweden it tends to be rather clouded in November. There's no much sun going on here, well, at least until March, a dark period. Well, today's lecture is going to be anything but dark. It's incredibly promising research on an area that is long lost, forgotten, at least when it comes to its medical purposes, and its neurology in connection with our fear response. The fear response, it's a grave thing that affects everyone, and especially in this modern culture, it's taking its toll on us. It is destroying our bodies from within and from without, and it's also disrupting our intelligence and reasoning skills. And it's a pity that intelligence and reasoning skills should be lost in this time and place, when we need it even more than ever before, because in certain aspects we are in grave times. So it's very, very promising. It's a bright new light, almost like the lights that's shining in through this beautiful window. So, as an introduction coming from the article by Ken Ware, it's called Neurology and Brain Damage or Brain Disorder. And he starts this way: executively or subconsciously controlled behavior is augmented through conditioned emotional regulation, involving discriminative acuity of danger, fear, safety, and reward cues. And this is this system that regulates everything it's referring to. So if the system works, the system will say okay to everything going on in the whole body. It's sort of a subsystem. But what is the case these days? It's the flight and fear response gives ideas of fear, and that is taking down the system, because it's built to do just that. We're not supposed to run away from a chasing animal with our intellectual capacities in use. We're just supposed to run and nothing else, or fight for that matter. But these are actually triggered all the time in modern society. I see the research here. It seems that 95% of the population is regulated by the fear response. That meaning it's constantly having an effect on everything we do, and actually is in control of what we do to a rather grave deal. It tells us what we can do and what we cannot do. So this is especially in the anxiety disorder spectrum. The spectrum means it's a great width, where you have in the bottom very light anxiety, and on top you have OCD, PTSD and similar things. But that spectrum seems to be something everyone can find themselves within. Intuitively, it has been assumed that a generous approach to fear extinction would remove the motivator for avoidance behaviors, which would consequently remove the psychophysical symptoms of anxiety disorders. This line of thought and its emergent fear extinction focused therapies has gained little scientific support despite its intuitive appeal. Instead, it has been determined that fear extinction in the adult system is difficult to effectively accomplish through the existing spectrum of attempted therapies for chronic anxiety disorders. Excuse me. I'll take some water. The idea of fear extinction is grandiose, as the title suggests, the elimination of fear. Controlling fear and avoidance, on the other hand, involves the controlled, systematic training of the patient's maladaptive path-dependent fear avoidance responses to discriminate environmental stimuli, which have accumulated pathological sensory generalization defaults to normal and non-threatening environmental stimuli. Well, that means that today we are reacting with fear to things that should not be connected to fear. Well, and that's the patient's maladaptive path. It's something we today cannot break. We can alleviate some of the symptoms with medication, cognitive theory has proven to have some slight effect, but it seems that it doesn't work in the long run. And there's even indications that the big pull on cognitive therapy here in Sweden, that started in the beginning of this millennium, has failed. They made the research on the results just a couple of years ago, and it seemed that it had been to no avail on the long term. And I would say that even our education never worked. The people got a relief of symptoms because they were doing the therapy. That seemed to be the reason. It's like the imagined idea of something helping them. As soon as the therapy was over, they went back to normal. And that shows that the path is still present. It's just how you perceive the path. And that's a little bit like removing all the symptoms. At its worst, it's just like removing the symptoms. It's still there. We know it's extremely hard to change these ingrained habits because they are part of our system, and it's very seldom in nature these things go wrong, but when they do, we know they go back to normal. It seems in human beings there is not that possibility of going back to normal. So this article will show and trying to identify the not so obvious potential and avoidable root causes or sets of initial conditions that may have contributed to the onset of these pathological conditions. And also the dynamical biology of long-term pathological fear avoidance and anxiety, highlighting how these rogue attractors can also manifest highly debilitating neurological restraints and conditions. And the third is, and courtesy of the acquired substantial empirical evidence, what we have learned through NPT, that is his system, neurophysiological therapy, regarding the training of this system's wide rogue initial conditions, and what is qualitatively required to hermetically perturb these systems' wide initial conditions in order to successfully escape the behavior governing attractive landscapes associated with patients' psychophysical anxiety disorders through the use of controlled novel forms of dose-dependent environmental stimuli. It's rogue initial conditions, what he's proposing here, and actually is full of things that we haven't known about before. When he says rogue, that's what it's referring to. It's not normal stimuli, as we usually think would trigger such a thing as fear reflex. The problem with fear reflex is built into its very system, because the fear reflex gets established because what we used to say, an external stimuli that was correct, something that caused the trauma, and that was correct. That's the only time when it's correct, in the initial conditions. This is the modern science of today. And after that, the system in itself produces fear responses to everything, or some parts of reality, depending on what part of the scale you are. Are you very low down, it could actually be a part of your life that causes fear reflexes to come about. We have agoraphobia, for instance, which is fear of squares or open spaces. We have on the other part claustrophobia, which is the fear of small spaces. And then you have arachnophobia, and so forth. Now we go a little bit higher up in the scale. Now we have generalized anxiety disorder, and that means it triggers itself from anything. So it takes as stimuli anything. It's a little bit like a small child that eats everything that can put in its mouth. You know that, and you have to take care of it, don't put that into your mouth. This is the system working on anything. And the problem here is, once the generalized anxiety disorder is constantly triggered, it never stops. It's going on all the time. And that means that it feeds itself. So we need to find a break from it. That's the only chance of stopping it. But what Ken Ware is proposing here, and this is quite interesting when he's talking about rogue attractors, that is something we haven't heard about before. I have no idea what it is. It could be very interesting to continue with this article. But rogue means that it's not something expected from ordinary thinking, like actual threat. That would then, in that case, be very interesting, because definitely something new in this area. And this, I don't think it's, I'm not going out on a limb here, it's not very researched to say that this is probably caused about human beings' plasticity. Animal is not showing up the same plasticity. It's an incredible advantage for human being to be that plastic But in this case, it's a tremendous fault. So animals are, you say, a bit prejudiced, more hardwired. So if you have a dog that's traumatized, you can actually turn it back. Would be hard, but it can be done, we know that. You can have a dog show no fear response at all. It would take a lot of work though, but it can happen. Whereas in human beings, that doesn't seem to be the case at all, because the whole brain changed, the whole system changed. It never changed completely in the dog, and more hardwired. Then he goes into anxiety disorders as a general thing, because that's a big thing today. There is at least 20% of the population in Australia suffering from anxiety disorders of somewhere in the scale. And it's become big pharma sales, to millions of dollars being poured into research and developments for treatment of anxiety disorders. Many professional careers have also evolved. The survival is becoming more increasingly dependent upon the application of assessment techniques and therapies for people who are suspected of having, or who suspect they have acquired, for instance, generalized anxiety disorder or the PTSD. This has become a major attractor, be it that less than 30 years ago the majority of people living in the free world had not even heard of the term PTSD, and hence the relationship to pathological, mental and physically debilitating conditions. And now we're getting into how it's possible to sort of understand what is this loop, because it's not a loop in a regular basis to be understood. We know well an individual's perceptions and subjective elevations of their sensations in the early states can be bifurcating, goes in two directions, contributed to the acquisition of more complex pathological states. And this is through the continuation of associated perceptive, subjective, positive feedback slope. In our modern, bigger, stronger, faster world, our fight or flight system that was meant to serve us and protect us in times of real danger has tuned rogue in the largest majority of individuals with pathological anxiety disorders, whereby they perceive normal, everyday environmental occurrences as threatening. Consequently, their fight or flight system remain powered up virtually 24/7. And this is regarded as a pathological learned fear. You learn it. Because of the plasticity in the system, you learn how to be afraid all the time. Humans also have an intrinsic capacity, which is in their best interest as a survivor, to mirror and socially connect to others in their environment. Mirroring or social connection, now believed to be the courtesy of primarily of special classes of neurons located in the brain, identified as mirror, or von economo neurons, VENS, has been very useful in terms of our psychophysical and social evolution. This built-in adaptations enable us to rapidly relay socially relevant information across the brain. Vents are a recently evolved cell type and are believed to be involved in the fast, intuitive assessment of complex social situations and be part of the circuitry supporting human social networks. Vents emerge in the frontoinsular cortex, mainly after birth, and increasing number until 4 years of age. Vents emerge in the consensus of the day suggests that they possibly play a role in the integration of bodily feelings, emotional regulation, and goal-directed behaviors. Studies have shown that there are decreased numbers of vents in neuropsychiatric diseases in which social cognition is markedly affected. Let me show you the mirror neurons. So you see here you have perception of an action. There you have goal attribution. Does this action have a goal? It goes down, yes, mirror neurons, internal imitation, embodied simulation, and yes, classical processing, inference. And no means only classical processing, inference. So mirror neurons can be activated after the goal of observed action has been attributed by other brain structure, only when it's a success, so to speak. And this is vastly interesting because this could actually, for my personal view, I've been thinking, how come the animals doesn't have it? Well, they don't have vents to a certain extent. Vents, these are special mirror neurons that human beings have that mirrors other people's emotions, reactions, even what they think. We are at the beginning of understanding what mirror neurons are, but it seems that we are connected to everyone else by these mirror neurons. And of course, it's not a far-fetched guess to say that has to do with human beings being very sociable animals. We beat all animals by lengths. It's amazing human beings have a capacity to be social, whereas animals have very little of that. But to some extent, when you look at the apes, it's still, compared to human beings, not as developed. Classic and easy identifiable ways where mirroring is useful is in the development of all athletes and all creative performances such as acting and ballet. Yet most of what we learn growing up and how we emotionally developed involves some degree of mirroring. However, there are potentially rogue connections to mirroring in relation to the onset of psychophysical disease and disorder. Ever present is the real potential for a person who has no known reason to be taunted by fear, avoidance and anxiety, but who is surrounded by others, close families, etc., who have these conditions, validated or not, may sympathetically begin to mirror symptoms similar to those of the close family members who have these conditions. These initial conditions, these are the first conditions, may then evolve into full-blown diseases and disorders through symptoms of something as extreme as multiple sclerosis, for example, but not return any positive tests that validate that they have an S. So the mirroring neurons can actually make a person who's completely healthy but has family members that are suffering from multiple sclerosis, showing up all the symptoms of multiple sclerosis without having disease. And that is because of the mirror neurons. You mirror automatically other people. It all stands to reason how and why this phenomenon could occur, as mirroring is a scale-free, non-discriminative phenomenon. I have witnessed and worked with quite a few clients over the years who had symptoms that reflected severe lesions of the brain-body system, yet no form of scanning or medical investigation validated the reason behind their symptoms. They may have had a relative that they were close to who had a certain disease or disorder, and they could have initially been told that they may have inherited the same disease or disorder. You see, it could be two explanations. However, upon investigation, they found that they have no mutations in the genes that are said to be responsible for the symptoms. So we can now actually see that it is made by the mirror neurons and not by our genetic makeup. That's rather extraordinary. Anticipation, and that's another interesting thing that can wear this up. Anticipation is also well known to produce symptoms in advance of any recognizable reason for a person to adopt the symptoms of a disease or a disorder, especially when there have been family members before them who supposedly inherited a particular disease or disorder. Inheritance is sensitive to patterns of beliefs, prejudices, practices, behaviors, and biases. Therefore, it could be argued that no person did not inherit the disease. What they inherited or mirrored were the same patterns of beliefs, prejudice, practices, behaviors, and biases as the family members before them. Therefore, they may manifest the same symptoms as those affected by family members. And yes, this can also mean that they activated the gene that is said to be responsible for their symptoms. Genes, however, do not self-activate. Genes require a signal from the environment or a perception of the environment to be activated. Now he mentions a person who's in doubt, but he's using him as a tool, I think, to prove something, to show something. Whilst relatively ambiguous and still controversial, the mean hypothesis is pertinent in this landscape. We need to remember it's pertinent. The word meme originated from Richard Dawkins' 1976 book, The Selfish Gene. And meme is an idea, behavior, or style that spreads from person to person within the culture. And meme act as a unit for carrying cultural ideas, symbols, or practices that can be transmitted from one mind to another through writing, speech, gesture, rituals, or other imitable phenomena with a mimic theme. Supporters of the concept regard memes as culture analogues to genes, in that they self-replicate, mutate, and respond to selective pressures. Proponents theorize that memes are a viral phenomena that may evolve by natural selection in a manner analogous to that of biological evolution. Memes do this through the processes of variation, mutation, competition, and inheritance, each of which influences a meme's reproductive success. Memes spread through the behavior that they can generate in their hosts. Memes that propagate less prolifically may become extinct, while others may survive, spread, and for better or worse mutate. Memes that replicate most effectively enjoy more success. And some may replicate effectively even when they prove to be detrimental to the welfare of the hosts. And here comes the funny thing, this thing happens in science sometimes. Dawkins himself intuited that there had to be a central governor behind mirroring and the transfer of ideas, practices, and behaviors. Dawkins himself felt so strongly that memes were embedded into the wiring of the brain. And in respect to mirror neurons and von Economo neurons, he was unknowingly correct. Mirror neurons were not serendipitously discovered by Rizzolatti and his colleagues until the 1980s. The idea that microevolutionary mutations and variations occur within the generic environment to coincide with alterations to behavior or the adoption of a practice or belief certainly has its merits. This is supported by our leading geneticists' present knowledge of epigenetics, which allows for a much more positive and negative phenotypic plasticity within the genetic environment than was thought to be the case when Dawkins and his followers conceived and evolved their hypothesis. Just give me a second. Sorry about that, that was just the alarm that went off. Apparently it starts the mobile, I turn it off, it starts again. That's the loop, maybe, I don't know. If we refer to the basics of what the meme hypothesis attempts to inform us of, and what we know about the function of mirror neurons and vents, we may comfortably hypothesize that the more people in any one community, society, and global community that succumb to pathological conditions such as depression, and those that have more specifically emerged from fear, avoidance, and long-term anxiety disorders such as PTSD, the more traction and sharing of these memes, if you wish, there will be, courtesy of our mirror neurons, dopaminergic reward neurons even. Yes, reward is also in the loop of reason as to why we do things we do. The reward might be that I don't have to go to the job that I don't like, because I've been diagnosed with general anxiety, depression, or a mirroring of symptoms could be stemming from an envy of another person, where it's being perceived that they are being rewarded for having, for instance, PTSD. For example, they may have more people caring for them, watching out for them, than they would muster up pre their PTSD diagnosis, and appear to be granted a lot of extra politeness and courtesy by others, for fear of upsetting them. So the question is, Is it possible for a person or persons in a group to mirror and produce alterations to the psychophysical phenotype to coincide with changes to the physical, emotional and behavioral architecture of people around them? If so, then could this even mean adopting the symptoms of disease or disorder, even though they have not committed the crimes to the psychophysical systems that others have committed, which manifest the disease and disorder in their systems? It is obvious that when a regional athlete is selected to play with a big league and moves in with the seasoned professionals, in no time at all, they physically and emotionally evolve and upgrade their skills to blend with the general standards of their teammates. Conversely, a high-skilled player can unconsciously devolve to the standard of a lesser skilled players if they find themselves committed to a not so inspiring team, where the players benefits the team more by performing at the standards of others. We are all familiar with the placebo effect. However, placebo is not often thought about as being scale-free and non-discriminative, where in reality the placebo effect is simply an innate brain-body response to some form of information that the person perceives is going to be a benefit to them. The information that the person perceives is going to be benefit for them. The information may come in many forms, such as a pill or even a motivational seminar. However, plasticity involved with adopting and practicing religious beliefs and ceremony, or a soldier neglecting a bullet wound to the leg to be able to rescue another soldier from the battlefield, are thought to be courtesy of the same psychophysical phenomenon. We have an interesting phenomenon here that has become called the tall poppy syndrome. It's a behavior controlling form of social pruning that tends to inhibit people from wanting to stand out amongst their peers and not upset the balance of social power. Fear of expressing and therefore inhibiting one's potential can most certainly lead to a special class of anxiety that can be just as damaging to a person's mental and physical health. The tall poppy syndrome is a culture where people of high status are resented, attacked, cut down, or criticized because they have been classified as better than their peers. This is similar to begrudgery, the resentment or envy of success of a peer. Tall poppy syndrome is rife in Australia and New Zealand. Thank God we don't have it here in Sweden. Well, I think we have, it's called the Jantelag. The Jantelag. Named after a famous novel, Jeppe på berget, Jeppe on the mountain. There are several mechanisms that afford the human being to be potentially mirror and adopt system and behaviors of others who are affected by depression and PTSD, for example. As you can see, there are many other multipliers that may potentially cause continuing bifurcations in the numbers of people being diagnosed and treated for depression and PTSD. Some experts in the field feel it is reaching epidemic proportions, and the bigger, stronger, faster world is causal of the evolution of this epidemic. There is certainly a lot of evidence to support this citation. However, when we consider the role the media plays in attracting attention to depression, the funding and investment that goes into research and the development and marketing of pharmaceuticals to treat this condition, will motivate and probably further the spread of these problems. Spreading. A Google search for PTSD and depression showed 38 million pages. And we have a development that goes like this. This is Australia. 25%, 1986. And for every decade it seemed to multiply, and it's more than the double today. It's almost 67% of the population that had psychophysical hypervigilance or anxiety disorder. So it's a development that is fearful. And it's very evident also in Sweden. Phobias, OCD, hyper-anxiety is developing immensely among young people today. Its increase is just incredible. Some people say that 30% of the students have some sort of phobia and some sort of extra anxiety. And depression is becoming severely common. This is often forgotten when we have greater threats, as we say, like the environment, and we forget that underneath and inside there is a problem growing, and that problem is not addressed at all with any medical treatment at this day. Nothing we can do. It's usually symptom relieved. And the most common procedure is use medication. And we know what medication does is just alleviate the symptoms. It does not take away the root cause. And actually there are indications it doesn't even take away the symptoms fully. People are led of not having observable symptoms, but the symptoms within remain. So we are doing some sort of outside cosmetic. I'd say this is a Pochomkin kulis, where we cover up the problem, we imitate ordinary medical science, and we think we can apply the same on these symptoms and these problems. Whereas it's completely correct in the medical science, if you don't have any evidence for the disease, it's supposed to be healed. We use that thing to address the inside of us. And I think that the problem is incredibly wrong. That makes big, big mistake. And I heard about the mirror neurons, but I come to think my own way of growing up. I had a slight stutter until I was 11, 12 years. And I think now, it was very slight, and that was an imitation by the mirror neurons from my father, who had a more pronounced stutter, because my stutter disappeared when I wasn't exposed to the influence anymore. And well, still to this day, but I didn't have the reason for the stutter. I know the reason for my father's stutter. It was a trauma, which is usually the case when you have a stutter, but I was just mirroring. And we mirror a lot of these things, and this is extraordinarily interesting. We were earlier talking about the body map going outside the body, and now we're having something that goes even further outside. It's a direct influence from person to person. And I was also thinking of something that happened to me when I was quite a while, 20 years ago. Somebody gave me a trip to abroad, and I thought, how should I go abroad? The climate wasn't that nice abroad. But I noticed on the Copenhagen, it was a drizzling rain and not very nice climate. It was cold inside. I don't even believe how cold it was inside. I noticed me smiling more, me more happy. And I came to the conclusion it was actually the environmental people, the people in the environment that influenced me. And we know today in Sweden, seasonal depressions are spreading in certain areas where we have areas where they're quite rare. And there's no normal explanation for that, because we are all in November here in Sweden, and how come it's much less, for instance, in the northern parts of the country, where it's even darker? If you go like 2,000 kilometers north of this place, we have less winter depression than we have here. How come? Well, people are very ready to answer. They say we have a lot of snow and then it gets more light. Well, it could be part of the explanation. It cannot possibly be all of the explanation. They don't have snow in September when the winter starts there. It comes later, I think. So the most interesting, these mirror neurons is a special case of the Kleingarten, where the outside actually becomes the inside immediately, because they react, the response time is very, very quick. So even standing in front of a person like I'm doing now, I might mirror that person directly, but I'm not. It's not to my consciousness to know. Very interesting. I think I round about here from Kunna Church and this lovely setting we have here as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.